see people with their very first use of methamphetamine end up with permanent neurologic, permanent brain damage.
The fact that drugs are only involved in an urban setting is a myth. I'm here to tell you that some of the worst areas in our county as well as the state are in rural areas.
We're seeing right now just an epidemic of methamphetamine use in this county. And typically methamphetamine causes psychosis, it can cause paranoia, it tends to result in extremely aggressive behavior.
Methamphetamine, crank, is spreading across our country like a wildfire. And if this trend continues, we will all be living in Crank County. Let's not make any mistakes about this. Methamphetamine is nothing like the amphetamines of the 60s and 70s. You really need to pay attention to this program because what you learn may just save the life of someone you love. You're about to meet some of the people who have done meth and overcome the addiction. And you will hear about some of the unlucky ones, people whose lives have been lost or destroyed by this deadly drug. You will also meet some of the professionals, people who deal with the after effects of meth use. Together, we will paint the whole picture of methamphetamine. When we're done, you will know the facts, and then you will be able to decide if this is something that you want to use or if it is something you want your children to use. You see, it doesn't matter if you're a parent, teacher, medical worker, law enforcement officer, or a concerned citizen. This deadly drug will affect you. At the end of this program, I will tell you how you can keep your family and community safe.
It is a violent drug. Unlike most every other drug we see, the amount of violent crime, the amount of violent family relationships that occur as a result of this drug are tremendous.
I didn't care about you, and I sure as hell didn't care about me.
One drug that I could certainly single out that I've seen people who use become someone other than who they are because of their methamphetamine use. Methamphetamine is a very scary drug from that perspective because I do think that it enhances people's aggression, their violence, and their paranoia.
Families will report this to us time and time again. They'll come to me and they'll say, this just isn't the same person. They used to be so bright. They used to be so energetic. They had a love for life. They used to be able to do all kinds of things. They just can't do it anymore. And these are from loved ones who care very much about these people. We see it from teachers all the time. And we certainly see it from employers who will watch employees just have a very, very rough time and kind of lose their interest in the job, lose their interest in life.
I got 4.0 my 8th grade year, all year. I was in alternative school. In 9th grade, I got 3.5, you know, all 3.5 grade average, you know, all year. 10th grade, you know, I dropped out of school, you know, and I had a lot of stuff going for me, and it was all because of drugs, you know, meth, mostly methamphetamines.
I was sitting at my desk one day at the Narcotics Task Force, and this individual called and asked for me by name, and my assistant transferred him into me, and he started off the conversation very calm, much like we're talking right now. And he indicated that he wanted to make a complaint about one of my officers. And as I proceeded in the conversation and tried to find out the specific details of his complaint, he became more and more agitated and more hyper. And before long, it was easy to tell that he was on a cellular phone, and he, in his own words, told me that he was tired of my officers following him around. As a matter of fact, in this particular case, they were on the roof of his car and started literally screaming at me at the top of his lungs for me to get the officers off of his car. And he then proceeded to swerve from guardrail to shoulder, from fog line to fog line, and slamming on his brakes and accelerating, and you could hear this over the phone. And he was obviously an extreme traffic hazard to everybody on the freeway, merely because of these delusions and these hallucinations that he was experiencing. And it was all in his own words, is that he was, quote, tweaking on methamphetamine.
We've always had this philosophy with drugs that, well, yeah, while they're using, they're not doing very well. But as soon as they quit using the drug, they'll go back to the type of person they used to be. And that's always been the underlying philosophy in drug treatment and families' views of someone in their family that may be using drugs. And what we're finding with methamphetamine is that that's probably not true.
In the end, really drove me on the brink of total insanity. Today, I still have effects from methamphetamine.
The risk is not everyone's brain changes back from that reset of chemistry that they just experienced from the use of methamphetamine. We see people that are left with permanent psychiatric problems. It appears to be very similar to paranoid schizophrenia, where they become very paranoid, they hear voices, they see things that aren't there, and they have a very difficult time sorting out life after a very low level amount of use. Some of these people are now 2 years since the last time they used the drug at all, and they still have the effects of the paranoid schizophrenic-like disease. By far, it's 85% of the medical problems we see as related to drugs, excluding alcohol, are related to one drug, methamphetamine. If we could somehow contain that drug and show people the damage it does, we would solve 85% of most of the drug-related problems that we have. Alcohol, marijuana, heroin, cocaine are all plant-derived drugs for the most part. Methamphetamine is a chemistry set drug. It's totally dependent on the person who's making the methamphetamine in their chemistry set. If for some reason they use chemicals that aren't compatible, or change the process, change the temperatures, change the distillation process, change whatever they're going about to do, they end up with other drugs besides methamphetamine.
So we're seeing more and more of the smaller labs that are set up by people who don't really have much knowledge about what they're doing, aren't aware of the hazards, and simply aware of the profit that's available to them because of the popularity right now of methamphetamines. So they're using a lot of the items that you can buy down at the hardware store, down at the pharmacy, those kinds of things, and they're manufacturing that stuff in their kitchens or in their garages, those kinds of things. There's a lot of methods for doing it. Some of them risk different amounts of dangers. The old system, the P2P method is what it's known as, was extremely dangerous. They did a lot of cooking, there were a lot of fumes. Mistakes that people could make during that process would result in fumes that would permeate walls, carpeting. Then the sludge or the byproducts was toxic chemicals that were oftentimes dumped in the ground or hauled out onto public lands where they were just thrown in the common landfill type settings and those sorts of things.
So I've seen a lot of 36, 37, 38-year-old people who are dying from cancer, and they directly relate that to being a cook in a meth lab, where all of their teeth have dissolved because of how those chemicals interact with bone tissue and calcium, that they're having very serious health consequences due to being a cook. This stuff is toxic, and yet, you know, when you see it in a little package, it's white, it looks very pure, it looks very innocent, but in fact, you're about to engage in a very dangerous activity by putting that into your system.
We've seen it destroy 40 and 50-foot trees where they've dumped it in their yards, and it's leached down in through the ground, contaminated ground wells, killed trees, like we said, 40, 50 feet tall trees that you wouldn't think it could be that powerful after, you know, a year of running a lab and dumping sludge into say a ditch behind your house, and we've seen examples of that where it's killed huge trees and contaminated wells, that kind of thing. That was a small motel down in California that 3 men apparently decided to use for a meth cook. The system they were using was called a phosphorus conversion. During the process, the reaction went wrong, and the 3 men in the room all died of exposure to the fumes that resulted from that. they weren't able to even exit the room. They had a small fan to vent the fumes. They were aware of some hazard, but because they weren't very good at what they were doing, they made some mistakes, and it killed all three of them.
It is certainly Russian roulette out there, and that's part of the reason I got involved, was I was seeing young lives at risk, people who were being put at tremendous risk thinking that they were getting good drugs. And the story's all the same. They know the person who manufactured it. They know the dealer. He's a really good guy. He has good stuff. He doesn't buy this other stuff. That's almost never true when we trace the source back. So when we analyze the white powder they get, it has tremendous levels of all kinds of toxic chemicals in it. Lead, mercury, aluminum, and then other organic solvents that are left over from the process because it wasn't done right. These sorts of things we're sure of are part of the injury pattern, but even if they can get pure methamphetamine, their brain runs a tremendous risk from the use of the drug.
One of the big problems with methamphetamine is you can't buy it legally. So it's not being made in a lab somewhere where someone is controlling what's in it. And so you often find people making meth by using all sorts of just common household poisons, in essence. Diesel fuel, they'll use it to cook it with. And so what you get is a very unpure, unclean, often mixed with poison type of drug. And so it's not just the methamphetamine itself, but the other chemicals it's being cooked with, made with, that can sometimes have as bad of an influence on someone as the actual speed itself.
And then there were a series of cases. We had a particularly bad batch hit the valley. There was a 16-year-old gal who was at a party, had drank alcohol, smoked marijuana before in her life. Somebody brought out some methamphetamine, and she took her first dose of methamphetamine and ended up with a Parkinson's-like disorder, where she'll always have a background tremor. She'll always walk with a staggering gait and shuffling type gait. And this is from 16 years of age on, after her first use of methamphetamine. We think it was because that particular batch produced a lot of health problems, that it was due to the bad quality of the drug. But we see other people get another neurologic disorder called choreiform disorder, where they have random movement of their arms and legs that they can't control anymore. That doesn't seem to be from just the contaminants. It seems to be reported just from the use of methamphetamine.
The individual that became addicted to methamphetamine was a professional. And what I mean by a professional, he was somebody that we would have in our house any day to work and repair a particular item. He was a plumber. And this individual had a beautiful home and a nice family, could afford a gardener. It was a typical beautiful home in a high rent area. And over a very few months, he lost his family, he lost his house, he ended up living in a little 2-room apartment, and he became so paranoid from the use of this methamphetamine that he would call us and talk to me on the phone almost weekly, hallucinating, seeing what he thought were my agents in his drywall or walking on his roof. And at one particular time he put the phone down and started literally tearing his drywall off of the wall in his living room to try to get to the agents that he perceived were inside the wall. This stuff does horrendous things to people.
A young gal was out partying with a friend of hers. They took out what would have been their normal dose of methamphetamine, had used it for a few years. Their life was slowly deteriorating, and they knew that, but continued to use. And they took out what would have been their normal dose of methamphetamine. It happened to be a time when the methamphetamine was much stronger than it usually was. They did their normal dose, and her blood pressure shot up extremely high. She popped a blood vessel in her head and had a stroke. We've had 6 individuals inside of a year come in who have broken blood vessels and bled into their brain as a result of the very high levels of blood pressure that someone can get from the use of methamphetamine. And it's because they don't know what they're getting.
Here a few years ago, a personal friend of mine who works in the criminal justice system had a daughter that was brutally murdered by an individual that was high on methamphetamine. And being involved in that investigation on the periphery, as well as having to see the body and deliver the death message to the parents and to the community, was probably one of the most difficult things I ever had to do. And knowing that this horrendous crime was committed by an individual that was high on crank. This young girl was just out jogging along a rural country road, getting ready for a local fun run that we have here that coincides with a parade. And she was training for that in an area that she's run numerous times before, feeling totally safe in her own environment. And then this young drug addict came along and snuffed out her life.
One of the most vivid ones for me, I was called to a scene where a young man had taken a Camaro, big engine Camaro, and went full speed right into a tree. The person riding with him was conscious for about 3 minutes when people got there, and said that he was trying to run down a kid that had been harassing him in school, but he was so high on drugs he didn't realize that the kid was really a tree and was killed instantly. I mean, the car was blown apart like the impact. They figured with no braking, signs of braking, it was probably going 60 to 70 miles an hour when it hit the tree.
Another young person high on methamphetamine, had used it several times, 17 years old, came home, was paranoid from the use of the drug, changed his brain chemistry to now make them paranoid. Thought his father was a narcotics officer. His father wasn't. Took out the family handgun and shot and killed his father. The young man was staying with his grandmother because his parents were involved with drugs. He came home, thought his sweet little grandmother was a narcotics officer, became very paranoid, pulled out a pitchfork and stabbed his grandmother in the abdomen with a pitchfork, thinking that she was part of a narcotics outfit. That's the type of change in thinking. In both cases, when they came down off the methamphetamine and we told them what they had done, they didn't believe us.
And it was really just self-induced insanity. You know, it drove me to you know, really to the brinks of death.
People don't want to believe that. They want to believe that if they have an affluent life, if they have an educated life, if they have a prosperous life, that somehow they're immune to the effects of drugs. It's just not true. Everyone's children are certainly at risk because it will be offered to them. And it does reach a point where parents, although they try very hard to educate and train, it reaches a point where it's their child and someone else, and it's their child's ability to understand what they're going to do next by either accepting or not accepting this drug.
And I just wanted to fit in, maybe. Or maybe it was, you know, whatever I seen around me, you know, that whatever I grew up around, you know, I was, I don't know, that's what I became.
We've said for years, just say no, and just say no is a very nice thing. The unfortunate part, it doesn't work for everybody. We need other mechanisms to empower kids, because part of the attraction of drugs is a way for them to empower themselves. Their ability to empower themselves into a culture that their parents don't know about, their teachers may know a little bit about, but certainly aren't involved in for the most part. A lot of their friends are, and they end up with special knowledge and this special group of friends that have now shown them how to buy the drug, how to take out the mirror, how to pour the powder onto the mirror, to chop it up, to put it into lines, to snort it, to melt it down and inject it, to swallow it, to however it's being used, to smoke it. They show them all the different ways that it can be, and now they have special knowledge and there's special friends that are cool. We've often thought that young people feel invincible, and that whatever they do, somehow they'll heal up from it, they'll get better, and they'll go on through life. But we've had numerous young people come through here with bleeds into their brain, with permanent neurologic injuries that leave them shuffling their feet or having uncontrolled twitching actions as a result of methamphetamine use, and have essentially severely damaged, if not ruined, their life from what started out to be fun. What was at least told to them by other people who were using the drug, that it would be fun and it would be enjoyable. And now there is no fun to it. There is no upside to it. There's only this tremendous downside that they're left with. Why do some kids not get involved with drugs? Well, there's lots of reasons. Their culture, their religion, the way they were raised, their family values, their own thoughts, their self-esteem. Many components fit into why a person either chooses or doesn't choose to use drugs as they march through life. One component that a parent needs to be aware of is luck. To a certain degree, there are people who don't use drugs just because they were lucky to not be exposed, to not be in that environment, and to have a community that was working as hard as it can to keep the amount of exposure a young person might run up against in their life to the lowest level possible. It's very much a wake-up call for parents. The youngest case I've had in the emergency room is 8 years old. He was given it from a classmate who was 12 years old, who was essentially becoming a mini dealer in methamphetamine, not knowing exactly what he was doing, but was giving it to younger and younger kids, and eventually ended up selling it to younger and younger kids. And the kid came in very high, very out of control, heart rate in the 180s, and was given a near overdose amount of methamphetamine unknowingly at 8 years old. It's very important for parents to talk to their kids, to be involved from a very early age. Families need to talk. They need to be involved. They certainly need to bring the subject up frequently. To not discuss the potential of drug use and the risk of drug use within your family puts your child at risk. It needs to be a regular sort of education that you do, just like you educate anything else. Your family discussion is probably one of the most powerful tools you can use in preventing drug use. And believe me, if you're not doing the drug education, someone else will be doing the drug education out there. And what I tell people is that methamphetamine is not your father's Chevrolet. This is an altogether different vehicle. It's much more violent. It's much more in its changing of what happens. And so people who tolerated amphetamine, the low-level amphetamine use that occurred back in the 60s and 70s, of the diet pills and the different whites they were called back then, this is not the same. You're dealing with something that is much more powerful, much more devastating, and changes the chemistry of the brain much more than they ever did.
As you have just learned, crank can be a killer. Make a commitment to protect your family and community by helping people understand the danger of this deadly drug. Because awareness, like knowledge, is power. And knowledge is the only thing that will help us beat methamphetamine.